She smells of the human quarter and old blood. Send her back to the kennels where you found her." The words drifted through the half-open door of the war room, and Seraphine felt the bond that had lived in her chest for 3 years snap like a bowstring pulled past its limit. It did not break gently. It tore. A white heat bloomed beneath her ribs, phantom claws raking the place where a mate's presence was supposed to live, and for one long, airless moment, she could not remember how to breathe. The corridor of Ironhold Keep tilted around her. Her fingers found the cold stone of the wall and held it, because if she did not hold something, she would fold onto the flagstones like a dropped cloak, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never let them see her fold. She had come to bring him his armor. That was all. The great burnished breastplate with the wolf's head worked in silver at the collar, polished by her own hands, because she did not trust the squires to do it right, because loving him had once meant learning the shape of every buckle. It hung heavy over her arm as she stood frozen in the passage, and she looked down at it now, the way one looks at a thing that has betrayed them. That was when the scent reached her. It was faint, threaded into the leather straps where they crossed the shoulder, but a Luna's nose does not lie, and a mate's nose lies, least of all. Jasmine and crushed iris and something beneath it, warm and animal, and unmistakably a woman. Not her own scent. Never her own scent. Seraphine had never worn perfume in her life. The pack could not afford such things when she first came to them, and by the time they could, she had grown used to smelling of pine resin and cold rivers and the herbs she dried for the healers. This was a stranger's perfume, expensive as a season's tithe, pressed into the armor of the man the moon had bound her to, pressed there by an embrace she had not given. Inside the war room, Corvin Blackmore, Alpha King of the Umbral Reach, laughed low in his throat, and another voice answered him, silvery and amused. "You still let her polish your things. How quaint. Like keeping a servant you're too sentimental to dismiss." "Sentiment has nothing to do with it," Corvin said. "She's useful. The old wolves trust her. When we announce the union, they'll grumble less if she's still standing quietly in the corner." Standing quietly in the corner. 3 years of standing quietly in the corner, and she had never once heard herself described so precisely, so coldly, so completely as furniture. Seraphine's spine straightened by some instinct older than grief. She did not cry. The tears gathered hot and swift, and she refused them at the gate of her eyes, blinking them down into the burning cavity where the bond had been. She would not give the corridor her weeping. She would not give these walls one more thing that belonged to her. She set the armor down, not on the floor, where it might be mistaken for carelessness, but on the carved bench beside the door, laid out neat and gleaming, the wolf's head facing the room so that when he came out, he would see how well she had cared for the thing before she stopped caring for him. It was a small, precise cruelty, and it was the only one she permitted herself. Then she turned and walked, and her footsteps made no sound, because a woman who has spent 3 years learning not to be noticed knows exactly how to leave a place without disturbing the air. She did not run. Running was for prey, and she had decided somewhere between the war room door and the top of the servant's stair that she was finished being prey. She walked the long way, through the tapestry hall where the histories of the Umbral Reach hung in wool and gold thread, past the portrait of the old king, Corvin's father, who had welcomed a half-starved girl from the border marshes and called her daughter before the bond even formed. He at least had seen her. He had been dead 2 winters now, and with him had died every reason Seraphine had to believe she was more than a convenient prop in someone else's ascent. In the physician's alcove, she found Maren, the pack's eldest healer, bent over a mortar of willow bark, her white hair pinned back with a bone comb worn smooth by 50 years of use. Maren looked up, and whatever was written on Seraphine's face made the old woman set the pestle down at once. "Child," Maren said, "what did he do?" "Nothing he hasn't been planning for months, I think." Seraphine's voice came out steady, and she was distantly proud of it. "There's a woman, high-born by the scent, iris and jasmine. He means to make a union of it, and I'm to stand quietly in the corner while he does." Maren's jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. "Isolde Vantmar," she said, and spat the name like a pit. "The Southern Envoy's daughter. She's been circling since the thaw. I hoped he had more sense." "He has exactly as much sense as his ambition allows." Seraphine pressed a hand to her sternum over the ache. "The bond's gone, Maren. He severed it. I felt it go." The old healer's eyes went wide, then wet, then hard as flint, all in the space of a breath. She crossed the little room and took Seraphine's cold hands in her warm ones. "Then he is a greater fool than his father ever feared. A mate bond is not a garment to be shrugged off. It leaves a wound that festers in the one who cuts it. He will feel the rot of it before the year turns, mark me." She squeezed. "But you cannot be here when the rot begins. Do you understand me?" Seraphine understood. She had understood, if she was honest, for a long time. There was a floorboard in her quiet chambers, the third from the window, that had never fit quite right. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the shape of a different life she had been building without ever quite admitting it to herself. Not treasure taken from the pack. Her own. Coins earned quietly over 3 years from the tinctures and remedies she sold to the human quarter through a discreet apothecary. A letter of introduction she had once written and never sent. A small leather journal of everything she had learned about herbs and healing and the trade of them, and a length of undyed travelling cloak that would let her pass as no one at all. She had told herself she kept these things for security. She had lied to herself gently, the way one does about a thing too painful to look at straight. And now she blessed the woman she had been for the foresight the woman she was could barely stand to feel grateful for. She did not take the wedding cuff of hammered silver he had clasped around her wrist at the joining rite. She left it on the pillow, coiled like a shed skin. She did not take the fine gowns or the circlet of a luna or the jeweled comb that had cost, she now understood, less than a single bottle of another woman's perfume. She took what was hers, and she took the dignity of leaving nothing owed. And just before the moon reached its height, she pressed her forehead one last time to Maren's, and stepped out through the postern gate into the cold, clean dark. And by the time dawn broke grey over the towers of Ironhold Keep, the corridor where the Luna used to stand quietly in the corner was empty, and she was gone. The morning that Seraphine vanished, Ironhold Keep didn't notice for some hours, and that fact alone would have told her everything she needed to know had she stayed to watch it. The kitchens ran without her guidance. The squires laid the tables. The great hall filled with the murmur of the pack breaking their fast, and no one looked to the corner where the Luna used to stand, because a thing you have trained yourself not to see is a thing you do not miss when it goes. It was nearly midday before a serving girl mentioned that the physician's stores had not been replenished, and past that before someone thought to knock at the Luna's chamber and found the door open, and the room stripped of everything a person carries, and full of everything a title leaves behind. The silver wedding cuff on the pillow was what they brought to Corvin. He was in the training yard when they placed it in his palm, stripped to the waist and gleaming with sweat, his body the envy of every young wolf who watched him spar. He looked at the cuff the way a man looks at a coin he does not remember spending. "She's sulking," he said, and closed his fist around it and went back to the ring. "She'll be in the herb garden by evening, or off crying to the old healer. Let her. It saves me the conversation." Isolde Vantmauer, watching from the shaded gallery with a goblet of southern wine, sweating in her ringed hand, smiled into the cup. "How devoted," she murmured, "that she leaves you her jewelry as a keepsake." And the wolves around her laughed, because that was what one did when the future queen made a joke, and the sound of it carried out over the yard and up into the grey autumn sky, and none of them understood that they were laughing at the sound of their own foundation cracking. But something else happened to Corvin Blackmore that afternoon, something he told no one, because he did not have words for it, and would not have spoken them if he had. As he lifted his sword against the next challenger, a strange cold sensation opened beneath his breastbone, a hollowness, as though a room he had never bothered to enter had suddenly had its door blown off its hinges and now stood empty and howling. He faltered. His opponent's blunted blade caught him across the ribs, and he grunted more in surprise than pain, and shook his head, and drove the boy back with a fury that had nothing to do with the boy at all. The hollowness did not close. He told himself it was the ale from the night before. He told himself it was the change in the weather. He told himself many things over the following weeks, and every one of them was a lie, and the wound Maren had promised him began, precisely as she had said it would, to fester in the dark behind his ribs where no healer he trusted could reach it. Seraphine, 3 valleys away by then and walking still, felt nothing of his hollowness, because a severed bond does not bleed both ways in equal measure. It is the one who cuts who carries the rot. The one who is cut carries only the clean, terrible silence of a music that has stopped, and she walked into that silence with her chin level and her eyes forward, and she did not look back at the mountains that had held her cage, and she didn't weep on the road, and she didn't once, not even in the worst black hours before a cold dawn, consider turning around. That was the thing they had all missed about the quiet woman in the corner. They had mistaken her stillness for weakness. They had never once considered that a person can be still because they are deciding, with great care, exactly where to place their weight before they move the world. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a keep that measures its history in centuries, but it is time enough for a river to carve a new channel, and Seraphine had always known how to be water. She had not gone far in miles. The umbral reach was vast, and its influence reached to the edge of the human cities that clung to the coast where the mountains finally surrendered to the sea. And it was to one of these cities that she had walked, a place called Calmare, all salt wind and crowded harbours and money moving so fast it left a person dizzy. Wolves lived there too, quietly, in the seams between human commerce, and it was among them and the humans both that a woman who could heal what neither their physicians nor their pack medicine could touch became very quickly a person of consequence. She did not announce herself as a Luna. She was no one's Luna. She let the name Seraphine stand alone, without a house or a title behind it, and she let her work speak, and her work spoke loudly. She took a narrow shop front on a street of apothecaries, and cleaned it and stocked it with the tinctures she knew, and within 2 months there was a queue at her door before the shutters opened. She healed a shipowner's daughter of a wasting fever that 3 learned men had declared hopeless, and the shipowner, a broad, quiet man named Hallvard Wren, who had made his fortune in the northern trade and lost his wife to a fever he could not cure, became first her patron, and then, in the careful way of two guarded people, her friend. Halvard was nothing like Corvin. That was the first thing Seraphine noticed, and the thing she came, slowly, to treasure. He did not fill a room with the pressure of his own importance. He asked questions and listened to the answers. When she spoke of the properties of a root or the way a wound wanted to close if you only gave it the right conditions, he leaned in as though she were teaching him a language he had always wanted to learn, and he never once, in all the months of their growing partnership, described her as useful. He described her as brilliant, and he said it as though it were simply a fact about the world, like the tide. "You should not be selling remedies out of a shop front," he told her one evening, over the ledgers they had taken to reviewing together, because her trade had grown too large for her to manage alone, and his mind for numbers was as sharp as her mind for medicine. "You should be supplying every physician on this coast. There is a company to be built here, Seraphine, a real one. Your knowledge, my ships and my contacts. We could put your tinctures in every port from here to the southern straits." She had looked at him for a long moment across the candlelight. This steady man, who saw her the way the old dead king had once seen her. And she had felt something she had thought Corvin took with him when he cut the bond. She had felt valued, not needed, not tolerated, not kept in a corner for the reassurance of the old wolves. Valued for the exact and particular things she was. "Half shares," she said. "Equal partners. My name on the charter beside yours." Halvard smiled, and it reached his eyes. "I would not have offered it any other way." They called the company Sablewell, after the deep well of dark water in the courtyard behind her shop, and they registered its charter with the Merchant Guild of Calmare on a bright, cold morning, while gulls wheeled over the harbour, and Seraphine signed her name in a firm, even hand, Seraphine of no house, and felt the ink dry into something that was entirely, unshakably hers. She was 26 years old. She had walked out of a keep with a bag of coins and a length of undyed cloak, and in 6 months she had built a foundation that no man could sever with a careless word in a war room, because she had built it herself, out of her own knowledge and her own labour, and a thing you build yourself cannot be taken by anyone who did not help you build it. Word of Sablewell travelled, as word of money does. It travelled up the coast and into the valleys, and eventually, though Seraphine did not seek it, into the very mountains she had left. Maren, who had a way of getting letters out of the keep when she needed to, wrote to her through the apothecary channel Seraphine had never entirely closed, and the letters carried news that Seraphine read by candlelight with a face that gave nothing away. The union between Corvin and Isolde had been announced, and then, curiously, delayed. The harvest tithes from the border marshes had come in short, because it was Seraphine who had brokered the marsh folks' loyalty in the first place, and with her gone, they remembered old grievances. The pack's healers, without Seraphine's stores and Seraphine's knowledge, had lost 2 pups to a winter sickness she could have broken in a night. And the king himself, Maren wrote in her cramped, careful hand, is not well, though he hides it. He does not sleep. He is thinner. There is a greyness to him. The rot has started, child, exactly as I said. He does not know what ails him. But you and I know. Seraphine folded the letter and sat for a long while in the dark of her shop, listening to the harbour bells, and she felt no triumph. That surprised her. She had expected, in the first raw weeks, to want his ruin so badly it would choke her. But sitting in the life she had built, in a city that had no idea a Luna had ever existed to be discarded, she found the wanting had cooled into something colder and far more useful than hatred. She did not need to destroy Corvin Blackmore. She only needed to keep building and to be ready. Because a man whose world is rotting from the inside will eventually come looking for a cure. And when he did, she intended to be the one holding it. The rot in the umbral reach was not only in its king, though its king was where it showed first. It was in the Union itself, and behind the Union stood a hand that Corvin, blinded by ambition and a woman's expensive perfume, had never once thought to examine. Isolde Vantmore had not come north for love, and she had not come north entirely of her own scheming. She had come as the instrument of her father, Lord Regent Alaric Vantmore of the Southern Straits, a wolf whose ambitions ran wide and deep and patient, and who had looked at the umbral reach, its mountain passes, and its iron and its command of the northern trade routes, and decided that he would have it, and that his daughter's face was the cheapest key with which to open its gates. Alaric understood things about Corvin that Corvin didn't understand about himself. He understood that pride is a lever, and that a proud man will destroy anything, even his own foundation, if you convince him that keeping it makes him look weak. So through Isolde, all through that long spring and into the summer, Alaric's instrument had whispered. She had whispered that the old wolves who trusted the marsh-born Luna were a leash on Corvin's true power. She had whispered that a king bonded to a nobody looked like a nobody himself. She had whispered that a union with the South would double his strength and his reach, and that all it required was the removal of a woman who, after all, was only useful, only furniture, only standing quietly in the corner. And Corvin, whose father had built the reach on loyalty, and who had inherited the throne without ever learning what loyalty cost to keep, had listened and nodded and signed his own slow ruin in the coin of another woman's scent pressed into his armor. He had not meant for Seraphine to find it. That was almost funny, in the bitter way Maren meant things when she laughed without joy. Isolde had left the perfume there deliberately, an animal marking of territory, wanting the Luna to know and to understand, and to break. She had expected weeping and pleading, and a scene she could report to her father as evidence that the marsh girl was finally, satisfyingly, undone. Instead, the marsh girl had laid the armor out neat as a gift, and walked into the dark and vanished so completely that no tracker Corvin sent could find her scent past the third valley, and Isolde, who did not understand dignity because she had never possessed it, took the disappearance as a victory and moved into the Luna's rooms, and did not once wonder what it meant that a woman could leave so cleanly. What it meant became clear as the seasons turned. The marsh folk, who had sworn to Seraphine and not to the throne, sent their tithe short, and their sons home from the levy. The eastern Pax, who had trusted the quiet Luna's word in a dozen disputes she had mediated without ever taking credit, found the king's justice suddenly clumsy and partial, weighted always toward the south, and they began to talk among themselves in the low, careful way of wolves, deciding whether a leader is still worth following. The healer's stores ran dry. The winter sickness came. And through all of it, Isolde spent, because spending was the only language she truly spoke, and the treasury that Corvin's father had filled with careful decades began to empty into silks and perfumes and southern wines, and the endless entertainments of a woman who needed constant proof that she had won. Corvin felt none of it clearly, because the hollowness behind his ribs had grown until it swallowed his sleep and dulled his senses, and left him raw and short-tempered, and always, always cold. He did not connect the cold to the woman he had discarded. He did not have the humility for that. He thought he was ill, or cursed, or merely tired, and he snapped at his advisers and drank to fill the hollow, and woke each morning grey and diminished, and the wolves who had once looked at him with the fierce love a pack gives, a strong alpha began, one by one, to look away. Maren watched it all with the patience of the very old, and she wrote her letters, and she waited, because she had told Seraphine the truth about the rot, and she trusted the moon to be as just as it was cruel. And she was in the great hall the evening the first real crack showed, when a courier arrived from the southern straits bearing a demand rather than a request. And Corvin understood, too late, that his union was not an alliance, but an annexation, that Alaric Vantmar expected the mountain passes opened to southern garrisons and the iron trade rerouted through southern ports, and that his own strength had been bled so thoroughly by a spending daughter and a rotting throne that he was in no position to refuse. "You will find," Isolde said that night, when he raged at her behind the closed doors of the chambers that had once been Seraphine's, "that you agreed to a great deal more than you read. My father is not a patient man, and you are not the king you were. Whatever is wrong with you, husband, it has made you weak, and weak men do not get to choose their terms." And Corvin, who had traded a woman who healed for a woman who consumed, stood in the ruins of his own ambition and felt the hollowness behind his ribs open wider, and did not yet understand that the only person in the world who might have known how to close it had walked out his postern gate 6 months before and built an empire, and was, at that very moment, signing a shipping contract that would decide the fate of the very trade Alaric Vantmore meant to steal. The contract came to Seraphine's desk on a morning of hard, bright winter light, and she read it twice before she understood the full shape of what had landed in her hands. Sablewell had grown faster than even Hallvard had predicted. Their tinctures moved through every port on the coast, and their ships, or the ships they chartered, had become a network of quiet influence that reached far up the trade routes toward the mountains. And now the Merchant Guild of Calmare, of which Seraphine was by then a voting member in her own right, had been approached to underwrite and provision a venture that would carry southern goods north through the mountain passes of the Umbral Reach, a venture whose sponsor was named plainly on the second page: Lord Regent Alaric Vantmore of the Southern Straits. Seraphine set the parchment down very carefully, as one sets down a thing that might go off, and she went to the window of the fine offices Sablewell now occupied above the harbour, and she looked out at the masts crowding the water, and she thought for a long time. She could refuse it. That was her first instinct, clean and hot. She could vote against the guild's involvement and use her considerable influence to see the venture strangled in committee, and Alaric's grand scheme to swallow the Reach would lose the merchant backing it needed on the northern coast, and it would be, in its small way, a blow struck for the pack she had left and the wolves who had trusted her. But a blow struck in anger is a blow struck once, and Seraphine had not spent 6 months learning to be water in order to throw a single stone. She summoned Halvard, and she summoned the 3 other guild members whose votes moved with hers, and she laid the whole thing out for them, not as a woman with a grievance, but as the partner in a company protecting its own long interests, which was, conveniently, also true. "This venture," she said, "is not trade. It is a siege dressed as commerce. Vantmore means to use our ships and our silver to plant garrisons in the mountains, and once the passes are his, he will control the iron, and once he controls the iron, he will not need us, and he will squeeze the coast the way he is already squeezing to the Reach. We do not refuse it." She saw Halvard's eyebrows rise, and she let herself, very slightly, smile. We take it. We take every part of it. We become indispensable to it. And then we own it. It took her the better part of a season to build the trap, and she built it the way she built everything. Patiently, thoroughly, with a healer's understanding that the body politic, like the human body, could be brought low, not by a single wound, but by the quiet failure of a dozen small systems all at once. Sablewell underwrote the venture, and provisioned it, and financed it, extending credit to Alaric's agents on terms so generous that they took it eagerly, and never noticed the language buried in the contracts, the language Halvard's guild lawyers and Seraphine's careful mind had woven together, that tied every shipment, every garrison supply, every coin of the enterprise to the good standing of Sablewell's charter and the continued approval of the Calmare Guild. Alaric Vantmore, reaching north to swallow a kingdom, put his hand into a purse that Seraphine held the strings of, and didn't feel them close, and all the while she gathered the other threads. Through Maren, she learned the temper of the eastern packs and the grievances of the marsh folk. Through the apothecary channel, she reopened her quiet trade with the human quarter of Ironhold's shadow towns, so that once again, though no one in the keep knew it, the medicine that kept the Reach's poorest alive came through a network that answered to her. She sent no armies. She raised no banners. She simply made herself, quietly and completely, the center of every current that flowed in and out of the mountains, until the day came, as she had known it would, when a man whose world was rotting would have no choice but to come looking for the coast, and for the company called Sablewell, and for its senior partner, whose name he had long since forgotten how to say. Corvin Blackmore was that man, and it was need that finally drove him south, though he told himself and his council that it was strategy. The treasury was near empty. The eastern packs had stopped answering his summons. The marsh had all but seceded. Alaric's garrisons had begun to appear in the lower passes, southern wolves with southern colours, and Isolde had grown cold and cruel and openly contemptuous, because her father's plan no longer required her to be charming, and through all of it, worse than all of it, the hollowness behind Corvin's ribs had spread, until some mornings he could barely rise, until his reflection frightened him, until the strongest alpha the Reach had known in a generation moved through his own keep like a ghost of himself, and saw the pity in the eyes of the wolves who had once feared him. He did not know what was killing him. He had gone to every healer left in the mountains, and the good ones were gone or dead or silent, and the ones who remained shook their heads and spoke of curses and could do nothing. It was Maren at last who told him the truth, or a piece of it, because Maren had waited a long time for this moment, and she intended to place her cut precisely. "It is a severing sickness," she told him, standing before his throne with her white head unbowed. "You cut a mate bond, and the cut is rotting in you, and it will rot until it kills you, unless the one who was cut chooses to close it. There is no herb for it. There is no craft for it. There is only her." "She's gone," Corvin said, and his voice cracked on the word, and everyone in the hall pretended not to hear it. "No tracker can find her." "No tracker of yours," Maren agreed. "But she is not hidden, my king. She is only somewhere you were too proud to look. There is a company on the coast, in Calmare, that has grown so great it now finances the very venture your father-in-law uses to strangle you. Sablewell it is called. If you want to live, you will go to it, and you will find its senior partner, and you will ask, humbly, for what you threw away." And she turned and left the hall before he could command her to stay, because she was very old and no longer afraid of him, and because she wanted to be gone before he understood the whole of it, so that the understanding would land on him alone. So Corvin rode south. He told his council he went to negotiate with the coastal merchants for the credit that might yet save his throne, and that much was true. And he told himself he went to find a cure, and that was true too, and he did not let himself think about who the senior partner of Sablewell might be, because a part of him had begun to suspect, and the suspicion was too large and too terrible to look at directly. He rode with a small guard, and without Isolde, who had gone south herself weeks before to her father, and had not troubled to say goodbye. And the further he rode from the mountains, the more the hollowness ached, as though every mile widened the wound. And by the time the towers of Calmare rose grey and gold against the winter sea, he was a diminished thing, a king in name draped over the bones of a starving wolf. And he did not look like a man coming to conquer. He looked like a man coming to beg. The offices of Sablewell occupied the top 2 floors of a fine stone building above the Calmare harbour, and Corvin was made to wait in an antechamber for the better part of an hour, which he endured because he no longer had the strength to do otherwise, and which was, though he did not know it, a courtesy far greater than the one he had once extended to the woman who now kept him waiting. When at last a clerk led him through into the senior partner's office, he was looking at the floor, rehearsing the humble words the old healer had told him he would need, and so he did not see her face until he had crossed half the room, and by then it was too late to hide anything from her, because she was already looking at him, and she had had 6 months and a whole winter to prepare for this exact moment, and he had had none. She sat behind a broad desk of dark polished wood, framed by a tall window full of masts and cold light, and she did not rise when he entered, and she did not speak first. She let him come. She let him lift his eyes and find her, and she watched the recognition move across his grey, wasted face in stages, the way a man wakes from a dream into a worse reality, the confusion, and then the disbelief, and then the terrible dawning knowledge, and only when it had fully arrived, only when she was certain he understood exactly whose office he stood in, and exactly whose mercy he had come to beg, did Seraphine allow herself to speak. "Sit down, Corvin," she said, in a voice as level and cool as the winter sea beyond the glass. "You look like a man who needs to." He did not sit. He stood swaying in the middle of the fine carpet, staring at her as though she were an apparition, and when he finally found his voice, it came out cracked and small, nothing like the voice that had once filled a war room with the casual dismissal of her whole existence. "Seraphine," he said, "you are Sablewell. You are the senior partner. You—" He stopped. His hand rose to his chest, to the hollow, an old, unconscious gesture she recognized, because she had felt its clean counterpart snap in her own chest 6 months before. "It was you, the whole time, the company that holds Alaric's ventures, the medicine in the shadow towns, the eastern packs. It was you." "It was me," she agreed. She folded her hands on the desk. "Though I confess, I'm surprised it took you this long to look. You always did have trouble seeing the things that were standing quietly in the corner." The old words, his own words, laid before him like the armor she had once laid out on the bench, and she watched them strike home. He flinched as though she had hit him. "You heard that?" he whispered. "I heard all of it. Send her back to the kennels where you found her. She's useful. When we announce the union, they'll grumble less if she's still standing quietly in the corner." She recited it without heat, without a tremor, the way one reads back a debt from a ledger, and each phrase landed heavier than the last, because there is nothing so devastating as your own cruelty returned to you in the calm voice of the person you were cruel to. I brought you your armor that day, Corvin. I had polished it myself, and I found another woman's perfume on it, and I found the truth of what I was to you, and I decided that I would never again stand quietly in anyone's corner as long as I lived. She let a silence open. So here I am, and here you are. Tell me, why have you come? For a long moment he could not answer, and then the strength went out of his legs, and he sat. Not because she had invited him to, but because he could no longer stand, and the fall of him into the chair opposite her desk was the fall of everything he had been. When he spoke, it was the truth, unvarnished, because he no longer had the pride to dress it up. I am dying, he said. The bond I cut is rotting in me. The healers say only you can close it. My throne is failing. Vantmauer is taking the passes. The treasury is empty. The packs have turned away. I have lost everything I traded you for, Seraphine, and I have come to ask you to save my life, and I know I have no right to ask it. He lifted his ruined face to her. I know what I did. I know what you were. I know now, when it is far too late, exactly what I threw away. And there it was, the thing the profile of every such story promises, and so rarely delivers with such completeness. The betrayer, humbled to the floor, confronting the enormity of the loss, and the wronged one holding all the power, and the only question remaining was what she would do with it. Seraphine did not answer him at once. She rose instead and crossed to the tall window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the harbour she had made her own, at the ships that moved her trade up and down the coast, at the cold, bright water that had never once told her she was useful. She let him sit in his ruin and wait, the way she had once waited in a corridor for her whole life to end, and she found, examining her own heart with a healer's honesty, that the cold, wanting for his destruction, had not returned even now, with his destruction so easily within her grasp. She could let him die. That would be justice of a kind. The rot would take him, and Vantmore would swallow the leaderless reach, and she would go on building her empire on the coast untouched, and no one would ever be able to say she had lifted a hand against the man who discarded her. It would be clean. It would be deserved, but it would also be small, and Seraphine had not spent 6 months becoming a great deal larger than the woman in the corner in order to end small. There is a thing you never understood about my worth, she said at last, still facing the window. You thought it was granted. You thought that because you had lifted me out of the marsh and set me beside your throne, my value was a thing you had given and could therefore take away. That is why you could dismiss me so easily. You were only reclaiming what you believed was always yours to bestow. She turned then and faced him, and her eyes were dry and clear and merciless in their calm. But worth is not granted, Corvin. It is proven, and it is built, and it is reclaimed on the terms of the one who owns it. Everything you see around you, I built after you threw me away, out of the exact things you called useful. The healing, the knowledge, the patience. You did not diminish me by discarding me. You freed me. So no, your throne did not fail because I left. It failed because it was never as strong as the loyalty of the people you taught yourself not to see, and I was only the first of them to leave. She came back to the desk and sat, and drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, and dipped her pen, and Corvin watched her with the desperate attention of a drowning man watching a rope. You want your life, she said. I will give it to you, because I am not the person you were, and because letting you die would make me smaller than I intend to be. I will come north and close the bond wound. Maren will teach me what she knows of the severing sickness, and between us we will end the rot in you. You will live." She began to write, her hand steady, the words forming in clean, dark lines. "But not as king. Not on the terms you knew. You forfeited the right to command me the day you called me furniture, and that forfeit does not expire because you are afraid. So here are my terms, and they are the only terms, and you will sign them here in this office, or you will ride north and die in your empty keep. Do you understand?" "Tell me," he said hoarsely. "Alaric Vantmore's venture is financed and provisioned and underwritten entirely through Sablewell, on credit I control. I can call that credit due in a single afternoon and leave his garrisons in the mountains without supply, without pay, and without the merchant backing they need to hold the passes. I will do exactly that, and I will break his siege of your kingdom on one condition." She turned the parchment toward him and set the pen beside it. "You will abdicate the throne of the Umbral Reach, not to Vantmauer, and not to me, but to a council of the Eastern Pax and the Marsh folk and the elders, chaired by Maren, who will govern the Reach by the loyalty you squandered. You will keep your life and your name and a place among your people as an ordinary wolf, which is a great deal more mercy than you extended to me. And you will sign in the same stroke an acknowledgement of everything you did, so that the pack will know the truth of why their Luna left, and no one after me will ever again be called useful and made to stand quietly in a corner while the person they trusted trades them away." Corvin stared at the parchment and at the woman across the desk, and the enormity of it broke over him in a slow grey wave. She was not asking him to kneel. She was not taking his life, or his freedom, or even, in the end, his home. She was taking the one thing he had valued above her, above loyalty, above his own father's legacy. She was taking the throne, and she was giving it not to herself, but to the very people he had taught himself not to see, and in doing so, she was proving, in a way no execution ever could, exactly how completely he had misjudged the worth of everyone and everything he had discarded. It was mercy and it was checkmate in the same stroke, and there was no move left to him but the pen. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Then you die of the wound you made, and Vantmauer swallows your leaderless people, and I go on with my life on the coast, untouched, and in 100 years no one will remember your name except as a cautionary tale about a king who could not tell the difference between a partner and a possession." She sat back. "It is not a difficult choice, Corvin. You made the difficult choice already, 6 months ago, in a war room, over a woman's perfume. This one is easy. This one is simply survival, and a chance to spend the rest of your life becoming the kind of wolf who deserves the loyalty you were born into and never earned." He signed. Of course he signed. His hand shook as it moved across the parchment, and the letters came out cramped and broken. But he signed the abdication, and he signed the acknowledgement. And when it was done, Seraphine took the sheet, and dried it, and sealed it, and filed it away in the great locked cabinet where Sablewell kept the documents that moved the fate of the coast, and the room was very quiet, and the winter light lay cold and clean across the desk between them. "There is one more thing you should know," she said, "before you ride north to wait for me to come and save your life." She folded her hands. "Isolde did not love you. She never did. She was her father's instrument, sent to whisper you into destroying your own foundation. And you were so hungry for a grander throne that you let her, and you cut the bond that held your strength and called it strategy. When Vantmore's venture collapses, and it will collapse within the month, she will be worth nothing to him, because a failed instrument is only a mouth to feed. She will come to you, or she will come to me, looking for a soft place to land. I would advise you to give her none, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. She taught you what a hollow thing looks like when you dress it in perfume and call it a crown. Remember the lesson. Corvin bowed his head, and when he lifted it, there were tears on his grey face, and they were not, she thought, entirely for himself. You could have let me die, he said. You would have been within your rights. Why did you not? Seraphine considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was, in the end, the only question that mattered, the hinge on which the whole of who she had become finally turned. Because your cruelty was yours, she said, and my mercy is mine, and I wouldn't let you make me small enough to trade the second for the first. You do not get to decide who I am, Corvin. You never did. That was always the mistake at the center of everything you did to me. So I am choosing, freely, to save your life and take your throne and break your enemy, and I am choosing it not because you deserve it, but because I am the kind of person who does not need your ruin to know my own worth. She rose, and the audience was over. Go north, wait for me, and on the way, think about what it means that the woman you called furniture is the only reason you will live to see another spring. He left the way beaten men leave, quietly, without ceremony, and Seraphine stood at her window and watched him ride out along the harbour road until the winter mist took him, and she felt, at last, the thing she had been waiting 6 months to feel. And it was not triumph, and it was not joy, and it was certainly not the hot wanting for his destruction that had choked her in the first raw weeks. It was peace, the clean, settled peace of a debt fully answered, a wound fully closed, a self fully reclaimed. She had not screamed in the corridor. She had not wept on the road. She had built and waited, and when the man who broke her came crawling for his life, she had held all the power in the world in her 2 hands, and had chosen to be larger than her pain. That, she understood now, was the only victory that had ever mattered. She kept her word, because keeping her word was the whole point of being who she had become. Within the month, exactly as she had promised him, Sablewell called its credit due on the northern venture, and the effect rippled through Alaric Vantmore's grand scheme like frost-cracking stone. The garrisons in the mountain passes woke one morning to find their supply lines cut, their pay unremitted, their merchant backers on the coast suddenly and unanimously unwilling to extend another coin, and a southern lord's ambitions, however patient and however deep, cannot hold ground it cannot feed. The garrisons withdrew, the passes emptied of southern colours, and Alaric Vantmore, who had reached north to swallow a kingdom, found that he had put his hand into a purse held by a woman he had never once thought to fear, and that the purse had closed, and that his fortune and his standing and his careful decades of scheming had bled out through 100 small contracts he had signed too eagerly and read too little, exactly as Corvin had done with the union that started it all. Isolde came south to her father in the wreckage of it, and found no soft place to land there, because a failed instrument is only a mouth to feed, precisely as Seraphine had said. Alaric, ruined and raging, had no use for a daughter who had delivered him a poisoned prize, and he cast her off with the same cold economy she had once used on the woman she called quaint for polishing a king's armour. She drifted after that, from court to court along the southern straits, trading on a beauty that curdled a little more with each passing season, and a name that had become, in the mouths of the merchant guilds, a byword for expensive failure. and the last that anyone heard of her, she was selling the jewels Corvin had given her to pay a debt she could not otherwise cover, and no one, anywhere on the coast, felt the need to offer her a hand. The decorative thing, in the end, had nothing to fall back on when the external power that propped it up withdrew, and it exited the story the way such things always do, quietly, in disgrace, unmourned. Seraphine went north, as she had said she would, in the last hard weeks of winter. She went not as a supplicant, returning to a keep that had discarded her, but as the senior partner of the company that had broken the siege of the mountains and saved the umbral reach from annexation, and the wolves of the packs met her at the borders and escorted her through the passes with a respect that had nothing to do with any title Corvin had once clasped around her wrist. Word of what she had done had travelled ahead of her. The eastern packs knew. The marsh folk knew. The elders knew. And when she rode at last through the postern gate she had slipped out of 6 months before in the dark, she rode through it in daylight, in the front, and the whole keep turned out to see the woman they had trained themselves not to notice, and there was not one of them, that day, who could look away. She found Corvin in the healer's hall, wasted and grey and near the end, and she did what she had come to do, because she was a healer before she was anything else, and a healer does not let a life fail if she can prevent it, whatever the life has done. Maren taught her what the old woman knew of the severing sickness, and Seraphine added to it everything she had learned on the coast, and together, over 3 long nights, they closed the bond wound that had been rotting in him since the morning she walked away. It was not gentle work, and it was not painless, and there was a moment in the deepest hour of the 3rd night when she held the frayed severed ends of a bond he had cut, and understood that she could, if she wished, leave them frayed forever, and let him carry the ache of it to a natural grave. She closed them clean instead, not because she forgave him, for forgiveness was a thing she had decided she did not owe, and would grant only if and when she chose, but because leaving a wound open when you have the skill to close it is a failure of the self, and she had become a person who did not fail herself. When it was done, Corvin lived, and the colour came back into his face over the following weeks, and the strength came back into his limbs, and the man who rose from the healer's bed was no longer a king, because he had signed that away in an office above the Culmere harbour, but he was, perhaps for the first time in his life, honest. He stood before the assembled packs in the great hall, thinner and quieter, and unmistakably humbled, and he read aloud the acknowledgment he had signed, every word of it, the whole truth of how the Luna had come to leave, the perfume on the armour, the cold dismissal in the war room, the woman he had traded for an illusion of a grander throne. He hid nothing, and when he had finished, he abdicated formally into the hands of the council Seraphine had specified, chaired by Maren, drawn from the eastern packs, and the marsh folk and the elders, and he took his place among his people as an ordinary wolf, which was, as she had told him, a great deal more mercy than he had extended to her. Seraphine did not stay to rule the Reach. That surprised the packs, who had assumed, some of them, that she had come to claim the throne she had won. But she had never wanted the throne. A throne was a cage, however gilded, and she had spent 3 years learning the exact dimensions of the cage disguised as a cottage, the status that was really only a leash, and she had no intention of clasping a new one around her own wrist merely because she had earned the right to. She had built a life on the coast that was entirely her own, a company that valued her for the exact and particular things she was, and a partnership with a steady man who had never once in all their months called her useful, only brilliant, only necessary, only the tide. So she stood before the Pax, and named the council their rulers, and named Maren their chief among equals, and she pledged Sablewell's trade and Sablewell's medicine to the Reach on fair and lasting terms, so that the shadow towns would never again lose their pups to a sickness she could break in a night. And then she went home to the sea. Halvard was waiting for her at the harbour when her ship came in, standing on the stone quay in the pale spring light with the gulls wheeling over him, and when she came down the gangway, he did not ask her whether she had taken the throne or destroyed the man who wronged her, or extracted whatever vengeance 6 months of patience had earned her. He asked her whether she was tired, and whether she had eaten, and whether the work had cost her too much, because those were the questions of a person who saw her as a person and not as an instrument. And Seraphine, who had learned the hard way to know the difference, felt the last of the old cold ache behind her ribs finally, fully, warm and close, and go quiet. "I am tired," she said. "And no, I did not take the throne. I gave it away. I saved his life, and I broke the siege, and I set his people free, and I gave the whole thing away, because none of it was ever what I wanted." She looked up at him, this steady man, against the bright spring sky. "What I wanted was this: a life I built myself, that no one can take with a careless word, work that matters, and someone who leans in when I speak instead of looking past me at the room." She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. "I have all of it. I have it because I walked out a postern gate in the dark and refused to be furniture for 1 more hour of my life. They built Sablewell into the greatest trading house on the coast, the two of them, partners in every sense that mattered, and its ships carried her medicine to every port from the northern ice to the southern straits, and its name became a byword not for expensive failure, but for the quiet, unstoppable power of a person who knows exactly what she is worth and will not sell it cheap. And in time, when the harbour bells rang out over Calmare on a clear autumn evening, not unlike the one on which her old life had ended, Seraphine stood again at the tall window of her office and looked out at the masts and the cold, bright water, and she thought of the woman who had once stood quietly in a corner and folded herself smaller and smaller in the hope that being small enough might make her safe. She wished she could reach back through the years and tell that woman the truth she had bought so dearly, that her worth had never been a gift to be granted or revoked by anyone else, that the people who make you feel useful and the people who make you feel valued are 2 entirely different kinds of people, and you must never confuse the one for the other, no matter how gilded the cage or how ancient the bond, that walking away from a place that cannot see you is not defeat, but the first true act of building a life that can. Corvin lived out his years an ordinary wolf among a people who governed themselves, and he was, by all accounts, a better man for it than he had ever been a king. But it is not his story in the end, and it never was. It was always hers. So if you are standing quietly in someone's corner tonight, folding yourself smaller in the hope of being kept, hear this before you close your eyes. You are not furniture. You are not useful. You are the tide. And the moment you decide to move, there is not a wall in this world that can hold back the sea. Walk out the gate. Build the life. The rest will follow.